now that Gear 5th is finally out in the anime, I think it's time we talk about what's really going on behind Luffy's new appearance and why we've already seen similar transformations before with both Hody Jones and the Sulong Minx. And I mean, even Imu's eyes share a little of that red ringed look, and that's exactly why it was not those eyes nor the all-white transformation that signified Joyboy's return in the first place. The reason Zunisha believed Luffy to be Joyboy was because he played the drums of liberation. It was his music. It was only because he played the same sounds that Joyboy did 800 years ago. This might have something to do with the fact that Luffy has wanted a musician more than any other position since the start of his journey, and that of course ended up being Brook, somebody who shares an uncanny similarity with Joyboy in that he also died and came back to life thanks to the power of a devil fruit, even if the methodologies were quite a bit different. Luffy accomplished this by pushing a human heart as far as it would go, and Brook did so without any heart or flesh at all. He specifically said that what holds him in this world is not organs, nor tendons, nor muscles, but his very soul. While Luffy is obviously the Joyboy, I would argue that Brook is almost like another version of him. And Joyboy was also said to put smiles on people's faces, and that's all Brook really does, whether it's with his music, his jokes, or his infectious laughter. And Brook has actually proven to us that music affects your emotions, and by extension, your soul and even your will, because during the time skip, he was able to convince the people of Namakura Island to gain the courage to fight for themselves specifically because of his music. This is kind of similar to Bello Betty's fruit power, but simply from a song that he played. He was even able to use his music to free the souls from the chest keepers in Whole Cake Island, which makes him almost like a totally different type of liberator. Now, while Brook does all of that with actual instruments, ones that helped him become widely known as the Soul King, Luffy and Joyboy play their music with their own heart. Their awakening allows them to beat it loud and fast enough to create the famous drums of liberation, and that would probably increase their heart rate along with it, thus tying it back to the powers of Gear 2nd. And that makes sense because the anime just confirmed that it is actually steam coming off of Luffy's body when he awakens, since it had the same kind of sound effect that we've heard in Gear 2nd throughout the story. Both forms involve increasing your heart rate, but Gear 5th's is just on an entirely new level, and one that probably requires the awakening of that fruit to accomplish. This is probably why when Luffy entered Gear 5th for the second time, he did it in the Gear 2nd pose. And right before he did so, he mentioned how when you're dead, only your bones stick around, which could easily be a tie back to Brook and how both of these guys are different sides to the Joyboy coin. And I actually pitched some of this theory that I'm about to share about a year ago in my 6th video ever on this channel, but that one only ended up getting 14k views, which is alright because we now have more than double that in just subscribers at 30k, which we actually got during the episode 1071 reaction, which is some crazy timing if you ask me. So major shout out to all you guys for the support. It's been crazy, and if you're looking for any additional content from me, I actually just started a second channel that I'm calling Redacted, where I'll have One Piece and JJK chapter reviews, as well as other anime related stuff, so maybe go check that out after this video's over. But let's get back to the theory. When Luffy enters Gear 2nd, he does so by rubberizing his arms and legs to basically act as pumps, which then increases blood flow throughout his body. And I think Gear 5th achieves a similar but greater effect by pumping his heart directly, instead of using his limbs to start that process. And that's why we hear steam coming off of his body as he enters that form. And maybe Oda decided to make his eyes turn red instead of his skin. Perhaps the white hair and god ribbon themselves are just steam that he turned to rubber as it left his body. His awakening already lets him control the rest of his body at will, and even turn his surroundings and enemies into rubber, so manually controlling your heartbeat seems pretty on par with the ridiculousness of Gear 5th. It's flipping the entire idea of Gear 2nd on its head, and by doing this, he was even able to will his heart to keep beating even after his body was past its limit, and that's how we got the drums of liberation. During his first fight with Lucci, it was noted how Gear 2nd was essentially allowing him to dope himself, and that it would be very taxing on his body. So in what I would consider typical Luffy fashion, he didn't even try to scale it back and be less reckless. Instead, he found a way to push himself even further and do something more risky, which resulted in the form we now call Gear 5th. Lucci even noted how it would be only possible for a rubber man to survive that kind of blood pressure, which only adds to this whole thing since we know his awakening is what enabled his new transformation. This kind of reminds me of what we saw with the Kong gun in King Kong Gun, because during Luffy's fight with Doflamingo, he flashed back to his training over the time skip where Rayleigh told him him he has to think of something other than Gear 4th because it's too taxing on his body, just like Lucci was saying about Gear 2nd. But what did Luffy do? He didn't do something less taxing, he decided to make his attack even bigger and unleash a King Kong gun, which ultimately did defeat Doflamingo. It's the same kind of energy that Luffy is channeling with this upgrade from Gear 2nd to Gear 5th. But I don't think Luffy and Joyboy are the only people who have ever tried tapping into that same transformation, because as I said before, we've seen something similar with both Hody Jones and the energy steroids, as well as the Minks and their Sulong form. All of these things turn the person all white with red ringed eyes. And since Fishman Island and Zou are deeply connected to the ancient kingdom, as was Wano, which is where Luffy first unlocked Gear 5th anyway, there has to be some kind of connection between all these places. I mean, all three of them even had road poneglyphs, which just goes to show there is some deep connection here. So let's look into the energy steroids first, where the side effects leave you looking very old, not unlike what we see from Luffy after he's done with Gear 5th. It's almost like this drug was meant to push people into a Gear 5th-esque form for a while, but without the rubber powers to help your body keep up with the changes, you get permanent effects like we saw with Hody. Like Lucci said, it's only possible for a rubber man to handle that. I mean, those steroids were the national treasure of Fishman Island, and both Dufeld and Stussy were in pursuit of them during Whole Cake, two people who were once tied to Mads. Perhaps they were looking to research those pills and even duplicate them like the new Fishman pirates did. This could even tie to Joyboy's apology to the Fishmen, because by leaving these pills with the Fishmen on the bottom of the sea, they were probably as safe as possible from the rest of the world, nor would they be destroyed by something like the Mother Flame because they're directly beneath Marijois, which obviously the world government wouldn't destroy. Maybe the pills were meant to help with some war or something in the future, or help as some kind of last resort for the Fishmen. As for Sulong form though, its connections to Gear 5th almost come from the opposite angle as the steroids. Where the steroids are tied to the science side of things, Sulong is tied to the instinctual or nature side of things, because both Sulong and Gear 5th could theoretically spiral out of control. Shaka told us that zone users usually lose their mind when they awaken, which is why they need the appropriate will to do so successfully, and Sulong users can fight themselves to death if they don't know how to control it. Both forms require the right kind of person to use them properly. Sulong also requires a full moon in order to activate, and one of the most iconic parts about the Gear 5th transformation was Luffy jumping in front of the moon as the Gorosei revealed the fruit's name. We even recently saw Beppo go into Sulong form without a full moon, thanks to what are probably some updated Rumble Balls that Chopper made. This could almost be a precursor of sorts to the energy steroids. Maybe the ancient kingdom made something similar to this, but anybody could eat them instead of just other minks and essentially accomplish that same form. I mean, the minks even live on Zunisha's back, and that's who told us that Joyboy returned in the first place. The minks even view humans as hairless monkey minks basically, and the current Joyboy has monkey in his name. We even saw a monkey with a straw hat on the Golden Bell in Skypiea, which is also where we first heard of the existence of a sun god and saw Luffy in the Nika pose. There has to be something important going on that connects all of these phenomena. I mean, Skypiea is also a place where their leaders are called gods, not unlike the celestial dragons who deem themselves the gods of the world today. And the current god of that arc, being Enel, did something very similar to Luffy, which is restart his own heart to save his life using his devil fruit. The two people that have restarted their own hearts in the story were gods in some form or fashion. And then we also have Brook over here who manages to come back to life without any heart or flesh at all. But the funny thing about Enel is that it wasn't Luffy's sun god powers, awakening, or even Haki that led him to victory. It was the most basic element to his powers which he's had since eating that fruit, and that's simply being rubber. It's an amazing juxtaposition where, yes, on one hand, Luffy has the most ridiculous Looney Tunes-esque power that we've ever seen, which grants him limitless freedom, but at the end of the day, it's all still just rubber. And so that has me wondering if this fruit is really based on a sun god named Nika, or if it just has that name for some other reason. Because one of the main things we learned in Skypiea, whether it was from Nolan's flashback or our own crew's time there, is that gods don't exist. It's the same thing with the celestial dragons. They aren't actually gods. Every god we have ever met in One Piece was only called that because people decided to call them that. God is just a title. So when we say that Luffy's fruit is based on a sun god named Nika, and we can also observe that his new appearance has already been duplicated elsewhere, I start to doubt that this fruit is really what the Gorosei say it is. It's kind of a chicken or the egg situation to me, where the fruit was either made after Sun God Nika existed and then was made in his likeness, or the fruit was made first and then Sun God Nika was just the first person to kind of popularize it. So throughout time, it became known as the Sun God Nika fruit, even though it is just a rubber fruit in practice. And now look, I'm not denying that this is a very special fruit, nor that this fruit is powerful enough to be dubbed a god fruit, because I actually did an entire video on what that means in this thing right here, but I think its powers are still just rubber at the end of the day. And it's only connected to this Nika person because of legends that were passed down over time. For example, in Dressrosa, they don't believe it was Luffy who saved them, they say it was Lucy, and they even built a statue of him. In Wano, the kids are being taught that Joyboy was the one who saved them, even though we know it was Luffy. The legends that will be passed down in these places will actually be inaccurate. Similarly, I think this so-called Sun God Nika was someone just like Luffy who took their rubber powers to the fullest, but their heroics led to their legends being passed down probably inaccurately, because just like Luffy, maybe the real Nika didn't want to be a hero, so they went by something else that we now know as Nika. So now when someone taps into those same exact powers, they're said to be like the Sun God instead of just the rubber person they actually are. The only thing that makes us think he actually has a zoned fruit, other than what the Gorosei told us of course, is that he has a startling new transformation, which we now know go hand in hand with zone awakenings. Kaido even mentioned how there are elements to both a paramecia and a zone awakening with Luffy's fruit, where all of the powers, including changing the surroundings, are akin to paramecias, but the appearance alone is like that of a zone. And like I mentioned before, that appearance has been duplicated with the energy steroids and Sulong form. It's the powers that separate him from the others, and also let him survive that form successfully. There was probably never an actual Sun God Nika, just someone who mastered those very same powers like Luffy did, and made a name for themselves around the world under that pseudonym. I doubt their name was even Nika. One of the mermaid quintuplets that we met was actually named Nika, along with Ichika, Sanka, Yonka, and Yonka 2. Each of these names are connected to a number, and I wonder if this family could maybe provide a hint to Nika's true name, or that maybe Nika originally had important siblings, which is something Luffy definitely has. So that's why I think this fruit might actually just be the Gomu Gomu no Mi in all practicality, and it was just given the Sun God Nika name because of someone who used those powers a long time ago, probably well before we knew what devil fruits really were, or before Joyboy was even around. And for the rest of time, when this fruit was used and even awakened, they were said to have the powers of Sun God Nika simply because they look and have powers that work similar to the legends of that person. Not because the powers were originally based off of some sun god, but rather the opposite, that the person known as a sun god just had rubber powers. Vegapunk mentioned at one point how the Gomu Gomu no Mi wasn't listed in even the oldest encyclopedia, which should make us think that it is definitely the so-called Sun God Nika fruit, but I actually think this is going to end up being a hint that, much like how the government hid the fruit's true name for the last 800 years, the originators of devil fruits probably hid that fruit's true name as well, which will unironically still be the Gomu Gomu no Mi, or maybe something else altogether, meaning that for once, the government were the ones being fooled all along. Maybe when devil fruits were first made, they were made knowing how important rubber would be, specifically because it can handle this special transformation, so they decided to hide that truth for some reason. Maybe hiding it as a special god fruit instead of simply a rubber fruit would stray the government from researching rubber even further. We know the government has researched gigantification for a very long time, and if they had just studied rubberization instead, then they may have already achieved what they wanted without experimenting on all these children. By labeling this fruit as a zone, it may have also made it more difficult for people to study it and try reproducing it because it would have been a different type than they thought. There are a lot of reasons that the originators of devil fruits would have hidden this one's true name, and it would flip this whole script that Oda has built around Nika on its head. And I also think that something similar is going to exist with the original Joyboy, where his true name is something very different than the moniker that we know now. This is something I need to say for an entirely different video, which I am working on right now, so make sure to subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss out on that one. But regardless of the fruit's true name, or whatever you want to call it, we can at least attest that his heart has something to do with the drums and this new form. When Luffy died temporarily, it's like he learned to will his heart to beat even when it should be far past its limit, extending his life to a point it probably has no business going to. Like his will will itself is keeping him alive. And that's a great juxtaposition to Brook, who basically did the exact opposite to Luffy. He died for so long that his entire body decomposed, and he doesn't even have a heart to pump anymore. Luffy is maxing out the capabilities of the human body, while Brook is showing a typical body isn't even necessary. It's all about the soul, or the will, you could say. Vegapunk studied the 21 grams of soul a while back, which is definitely a parallel to the real-life experiments about the same thing, but it's also somewhat of a confirmation that there is a physical soul element to all of this, and that's probably the cloud that Brook became in between his death and resurrection. He said his powers are what lets him stay on this mortal plane, hinting that there is another plane that souls reside in. Since I spent most of this video dissecting Luffy's awakening, maybe it's time we should think about Brook's. As we know, paramecia fruits tend to affect their surroundings with their abilities. For people like Katakuri and Doflamingo, that would involve turning the environment around them into the substance that they control, like mochi or strings. But for Law and Kid, it's about affecting their weapons or their opponents. Law used Kroom on his sword to hurt Big Mom from the inside, and Kid was able to magnetize Big Mom or create a railgun. So paramecias do have a trend to them, but are also not that straightforward at the same time. Brook's power is supposed to be about reviving or resurrection. However, it also extends to a broader control over his own soul and even others to a degree. So the first idea for his awakening that I want to discuss is that he can maybe amplify his music to affect people's emotions even more directly. We've already seen something like this with the people on Namakura Island, but do you also remember Miss Golden Week from Baroque Works? She was able to use paint to influence Luffy's emotions, so much so that he couldn't even help his friends anymore. She didn't even have a devil fruit power either, which is something we definitely need to learn more about. But then we also met Perona, who uses ghosts to turn people negative. And Brook can already turn into a ghostly form and affect people's emotions on some level as it is. So I wonder if his awakening could let him fine-tune the emotions that people get and how strong of opponents could be affected by it. But the second idea for his awakening is maybe a little more interesting, because I think it could act a lot like Big Mom's current power, but without the need for other people's souls. Because Big Mom is able to take other people's souls and put them into inanimate objects, or slightly animate objects I guess, like plants and stuff, and create a homie whose power level somewhat correlates to the soul that she put inside of it. So maybe Brook's awakening, since paramecia awakenings do affect the environment, would let him make his own homies out of the area around him, spreading his soul and even will to the environment that's surrounding him. Almost like a spirit bomb from Dragon Ball, but like the opposite, where his soul power is going to everything else. This might even tie to the breath of all things, which is something we haven't heard a lot about since Zoro's fight with Mr. One. Now this could have just been Oda's earliest version of observation haki or even the voice of all things, but it did give us the idea that the environment around us has a will of some sort. And this is something I may have not thought about too deeply if Zoro and Brook didn't have a million connections to each other. I mean, Zoro wants to be the king of hell, while Brook is cosplaying as the Grim Reaper and has actually visited the underworld. Speaking of which, Zoro was visited by the literal Grim Reaper after he beat King, and after he woke up, he joked that he returned from hell to kill Sanji. Zoro is also the one who defeated Ryuma to return Brook's soul in the first place, and Zoro even left Yubashiri at the Rumbar Pirate's gravesite. You could even argue that Brook being lost for 50 years while searching for his body is something that Zoro would do, and Luffy even joked that he was as dumb as Zoro after explaining that. Brook was even the second in command on his former crew and took over as captain after Yorkie died from his illness, and Zoro was Luffy's first mate and is usually depicted as kind of the right-hand man. So long story short, maybe Brook's awakening lets him tap into the life that is all around us to help him in some kind of fight, like mainly against the Blackbeard pirates. And while we're on that topic, he's definitely gonna fight Vasco Shot. I discussed that idea before in another video, and while I did get Vasco Shot's fruit wrong, the matchup is almost even more locked in since it would be the Booze fruit versus the man who sings about Bink's brew. Vasco also catches his sake on fire, and Brook channels his chill from the underworld, which is just a good juxtaposition in and of itself. And while Brook is pretty weird for all the panty jokes, Vasco is straight up the creepiest character in the entire series. So since Brook has proven to us that the underworld exists and appears to be a place that you can actually visit, I wonder if their fight somehow ends up there. If it's supposed to be cold thanks to Brook's ice abilities, then Vasco's fire could be a perfect juxtaposition where he almost tries to melt the place down, maybe even freeing some souls in the process. And that idea actually reminds me of the sacred trees in Shandora. Nolan chopped these trees down because they contain tree fever, but of course, we later learned that those trees supposedly supposedly held the souls of the Shandorian ancestors. If that was somehow true, maybe somebody with Brook's fruit awakened there in the past and accomplished that, like a past user turned that area into a place where souls could actually return to. But if those trees are sick and making other people sick, then the souls within them may have been suffering inside as well, and thus needed liberated in a way, which is actually what Nolan did. Maybe the underworld is somewhat similar to this, where it's just a place housing all the souls of the dead, similar to those trees. And maybe Vasco, or even some other villain, will try to free those souls at some point in the story. So unlike the sacred trees in Shandora, where freeing those souls was probably a good thing, these souls need to be kept where they are, and that's where Brook's awakening comes into play. And if we're going to have trees with souls inside of them, then why not fruits, like devil fruits? We already know that devil fruits kind of reincarnate once a user dies, and zone fruits have wills of their own, although I think all of them do, to be honest, but maybe there are souls inside of them too, and perhaps Brook is the one to free all of them eventually, thus becoming a different kind of warrior of liberation. While Luffy and Joyboy take the human body to its fullest potential and put smiles on faces everywhere, Brook could basically be doing the same thing, but also acting as an almost Grim Reaper-like character by making sure the souls are all where they're supposed to be, meaning they both have some kind of role to play as a kind of Joyboy. And if you want to hear more about those sacred trees and what Nolan's backstory was all about, definitely check this video out that I have on screen right now. But until next time, later.